Hi,
Hi
guys.
there.
Hi, everyone.
Hello, everyone. As you're all getting kind of settled in, let me introduce myself. I'm Mandana Shaffa, and we are delighted that you're joining us today to celebrate My Shadow is My Skin, Voices from the Iranian Diaspora, edited by Katherine Whitney and Layla Emery, and published by the University of Texas Press in late March. We'd appreciate it if you could keep yourselves muted during the event. Once we're ready for questions, we'll enable the chat room and invite you to ask them there. I have the distinct honor of introducing our moderator and my talented fellow collaborator in My Shadow is My Skin, Farnaz Fatemi. Farnaz is a writer and editor and child of Iranian parents who was raised in Southern California in the 70s and 80s. She's a co-founder of the Hive Poetry Collective, which presents a weekly radio show, a podcast, and live readings in Santa Cruz County. Her poetry and prose has appeared in Grist Journal, Swim Daily, Catamaran Literary Reader, Crab Orchard Review, and several anthologies, including most recently, and I love this title, Halal If You Hear Me. She taught writing at UC Santa Cruz until 2018 and has recently completed a hybrid manuscript called Sister Tongue, which is currently making the rounds at publishers. So yes, everybody mute yourselves, and Farnaz, please take it away.
Thank you so much, Mandana. It's so great to be here for the third of this series of readings from My Shadow is My Skin. And thank you for all of you who've been to other events this month. And it's great to get the support. The readers have been having a great time, and it's really wonderful to moderate this last one of these three. I want to bring up one more of note in June, and we will post this in the chat later or now, depends, or both. And that is out in the diaspora, and that is June 20th. And we'll feature two of the contributors to this book, and out in the diaspora, LGBTQAI, and that is supported by San Francisco State's Iranian, I'm sorry, I don't remember the full name, the Institute for Iranian Diasporic Studies. Again, you can find out more about this in the chat, but you can also find out more about the book on Twitter at Iran Musings, also on Instagram at My Shadow is My Skin, and we will try to post those again later as well. Hopefully you've all seen the book now. If anybody else has it, you can see it. The book is available on bookshop.org. Still, yeah, there's Iraj's. If you don't have it yet, please order it, support it. But if you do have it and you like it, you can review it at Goodreads and Amazon, and you can buy another copy for friends, for teachers you know, and hopefully you'll want to do that. I know you'll want to do that after the next hour and hour plus. So the book is really skillfully edited by Layla Emery and Katherine Whitney, and Katherine we are lucky enough to have as one of the readers tonight, so we get to hear from her as a contributor and as an editor. What I love most about this book is really the diversity of the voices. And rereading the pieces for tonight made me excited about all the things I just still don't know about the diaspora, about diasporic Iranians in the United States. And realizing that those are things I don't know makes me realize how important this book is for both people inside this community and outside. Just in the 5 pieces from whose authors you'll hear from tonight, there are really interesting divergences, including, you'll probably hear excerpts from this, 2 very different ways the holiday known as Nowruz shows up in the author's mind, the way that holiday plays a role in the conception of Iran, and also 2 noticeably contrasting relationships to the traditions in Iranian weddings. So what we're doing tonight is we'll hear from all 5 readers, 5 or 6 minutes or so from each author, and you're in for a treat. And then the writers will answer questions about the book and their work as writers. I have a lot of questions already for them, and I assume you will too. At the end of the reading period, we will open the chat, and you can type your questions and comments there, and we'll pull questions from there. But again, I will start that conversation. What I'd like to do now is introduce our 5 readers, and if you want to look at your screen, I'm going to ask each of them to wave, and this is in the order of reading tonight. Dena Rod, Roia Ferrazares, Shokoofeh Rajabzadeh, there. Katherine Whitney, wonderful. Iraj, Isaac, Rahmim, great. So we will start with Dena Rod. Through creative nonfiction essays and poetry, Dena aims to illuminate their diasporic experiences of Iranian American heritage and queer identity, combating negative stereotypes of their intersections in the media. Catch them on Twitter at @lightningrod and denarod.com.
Yeah.
Dena.
Hey everyone, thank you so much for joining us this Sunday or Saturday. I don't even know what day it is anymore. My essay is called Pushing the Boundaries, and I'm very fortunate that Katherine and Layla selected it for publication for this anthology. It talks about the tension that I feel between my queerness and my Iranian identity, and from the consequences for being openly queer in Iran are dire, as homosexuality is a sin, and the consequence is death. I have never been to Iran, but I feel an intense need to go despite my misgivings. Yet with every word I write, that possibility grows slimmer and slimmer. My parents have always discouraged me, telling me to go anywhere else on earth. Go to Dubai, go to India, even go to the Emirates, just don't go to Iran, my dad always says. The sentiment is understandable, as they can't accompany me if I go, so they'd be helpless to assist me if anything untoward were to happen. Yet I can't deny my desire to see Shiraz, the town my dad grew up in, and Abadan, where my mother grew up. I need to see the ruins of Persepolis and Dena, the highest peak in the Zagros Mountains, which I'm named after. But how am I supposed to travel to the villages where my parents grew up in a country I've never been to and not bring my wife? How could we take such a life-affirming journey together and not display any affection toward one another? Homosexuality is an open secret in Iranian society, told in whispers rather than in marched parades. Discovering my queerness has taken place against a backdrop of American protests, the legacy of Stonewall riots begun by transgender people of color in New York City, and efforts to claim queer identity loud and proud. Among Iranians, those of us who come out despite our family's wishes for a glass-closeted existence are seen as rocking the boat, advised not to tell anyone outside a small circle. My uncle Rasul always encouraged me to speak openly about my wife, Diana, to the rest of my extended family. He was the only one who insisted on meeting her when he came back to California to visit from North Carolina. You need to be public about this, he advised. We're in America. There should be no more living in shame. But will my decision to live a more authentic life prevent me from seeing Iran? I don't know whether my extended family still living there knows about my queerness. How could I ask them to sponsor a visa for myself and my wife, knowing it might put them in jeopardy with the Iranian government? How could I properly see the country with a state-mandated tour guide watching our every move? And would having a white woman accompanying me prevent access to spaces that I otherwise be able to enter? Thank you. My name is Dena Rod.
Wonderful. Thank you. Again, that was Dena Rod. And next we have Roia Ferrazares. Roia is an emerging prose and short story writer. Her piece, In My Shadow Is My Skin, is her first work in printed form, although she has published her pieces on websites such as Iranian.com and PersianMirror.com. She has found that her connection through her Persian mother with Persian language, food, music, and poetry are the most profound and influential in her writing. Her writing primarily grapples with Iranian American identity formation in the diaspora. Roia.
Thank you, Farnaz. I'm so thrilled to be a part of this book. I've found sort of a community that I didn't even realize I could have through having a piece in it. So I'm really pleased to be here, and thanks for giving me an opportunity to share. So I've picked an excerpt from my piece. I'm not starting from the beginning, I'm starting from the middle, and I'll be ending just short of the ending. So it's an excerpt, and if you want to hear the whole thing, you'll have to get the book in order to get the full taste. It's a memory back from 1975. Okay, I'll start. It's called Uninvited Guest. The room was cool and shadowy in the late afternoon when my parents led me down to meet the mysterious guest. Our black upright piano with its bench settled underneath stood against the wall next to the old Zenith TV sitting darkly on its rolling cart. Both sat waiting for me to awaken them from sleep, my typical afternoon routine. But that trunk, surrounded by our big corduroy pillows, that was new, unexpected, uninvited even. All else was forgotten. The trunk tickled my memory in a way that made me irritable. It was a curious reminder of the half of me that was an odd color and smelled of celery stew and rose water, the half of me that I usually tried to ignore in an effort to fit in at my lily white school. My year in Iran when I was 3 and 4 was like a closed chapter of one of my father's library books, black and white pictures of artifacts and statues, flashes of memory, paper school books and pots of steaming rice, the bright orange of a glass of fresh carrot juice. Iran was a nursery rhyme that I didn't understand, but whose unintelligible syllables and phrases were always accessible on my tongue. Iran was the sound of my mother's shouts into our pastel blue princess phone on New Year's Day. Her voice heard in the kitchen, desperately reaching, searching, shouting in the language that was familiar yet incomprehensible to me now. Iran was the phone inevitably handed to me by my mother, tears streaming down her face, to hear a tinny, distant voice calling my name in answer to my small, hello? The awkward silence when I didn't know what else to say. And when this steamer trunk was finally opened, it brought forth all these feelings of awkwardness and estrangement in a flood that made me breathless. My 3rd grade reader and binder were set aside on the piano bench as I watched my father cut the thick rope with our kitchen knife, letting it fall away to expose the heavy padlock that had been hidden underneath. Within minutes, he produced the key, as if it had been all along kept at arm's reach, and the top was lifted, too heavy for me, to rest on its hinges. The smell of stale air mixed with mothballs lingered in my nose as I stretched my neck to peer inside. Its dark gut was still and full, so large it could have swallowed me whole. My mother, chatty and exuberant, welcomed each item from its depth as she gingerly removed them. Small rugs with bright patterns, a tiny sheepskin hat that I could hardly believe I had ever worn, an ornamental samovar with matching teacups the size of thimbles, clothes too small or too big, wraps, shawls, and stiff beaded shoes of gaudy colors that were awkwardly narrow. Initially, I stood away and poked at these things with outstretched fingers, but with an insistence that could not be ignored, my mother bid me to remove my jeans and t-shirt, and I found myself in their midst. Everything was scratchy against my skin and old and carried a smell so strong it assaulted me and seeped around the far corners of the room. But the items brought those familiar tears to my mother's eyes, induced by feelings of nostalgia for a faraway home fading from her memory. Once released and back in my familiar clothes, I gladly disappeared into the kitchen to make her a cup of strong black tea and leave her with these unwelcome guests. I stole peeks at her melancholy profile as I waited for the kettle to whistle. When my mother was satisfied that she had unfolded each item, caressed each with nostalgia and longing, and then refolded each with the same creases, she began returning them to their waiting vault. The trunk, witnessing this whole scene, was eventually closed with a slam, and my mother sprang up from her squat, refreshed with a light step. Thank you.
Wonderful. So I'm so enjoying hearing from my fellow contributors out loud. It's just wonderful. That was Roia Ferrazares. Next we have Shokoofeh Rajabzadeh, who is a new mom and a writer. teacher, scholar, and activist. She is currently a PhD candidate in English language and literature at the University of California, Berkeley, focusing on the racialization of Muslims and the history of Islamophobia in pre-modern England. As an activist, she's committed to anti-racist pedagogy. Her poetry has appeared in Poetry Northwest and Modern Poetry in Translation. She's currently working on a graphic memoir with her sister, Rajabzadeh, who is in the piece you'll hear from, titled Always Not Quite, that tells the story of their experiences immigrating to the United States and growing up Muslim after 9/11. And you can read from Always Not Quite on their website, their Medium website at Always Not Quite, the number 1, Always Not Quite 1. Shokoofeh Rajabzadeh.
Hi, thank you so much. It's such a pleasure to be here, and it's such an honor to be in this book. So when I submitted that bio, I was a new mom. Now my baby's almost 2 next month, and so I keep thinking back to actually when I was 6 and I kind of wrote my first little book, and I think part of me kind of wants to go back to that little girl and say, like, one day you're going to have an essay published in a book that looks as beautiful as this, because she wouldn't believe it. So so thank you so much for giving me this chance. So the piece I'm going to read from is called My Mom Killed Michael Jackson. So the secret is out. And I'm going to start from kind of part in the middle. And so the first part, just for quick context, discusses how the first time we go back to Iran after we immigrated. I was 3 when we immigrated, and the first time we go back, I'm 12. And Michael Jackson kind of serves as the soundtrack for our first experiences being kind of a normal teenager, since we were kind of denied that in America up until that point. And so this is kind of coming back to California. It starts from there. So my mother was also different during those months we spent in California. In Iran, we cherished her resonant laugh that emerged from the corner where she huddled with her sisters, losing track of meals and prayer times. In the States, we noticed our mother turning more and more to prayer. She prayed more often and for longer hours in California than she ever did in Iran. The prayer itself took only minutes, but my mother stayed either kneeling or prostrated on the prayer rug with her airy dark blue paisley printed chador over her head for an hour or 2 afterwards. She gently rocked back and forth while whispering, and all we could hear were the occasional sounds that made it past the uneven space between her top and bottom rows of teeth. When we were little, we dashed in and out of her chador whenever she stood at prayer. If we timed it just right and had all our toys at hand, we could slip under the light fabric draped over her body, play a few seconds of house, pour each other a cup of invisible tea from our plastic teapot, and then dash back out before she bent over in prayer and knocked her butt on our heads. We would poke her butt when she had her forehead to the ground and try to tickle the bottoms of her feet, and when none of that distracted her enough, we'd say the word fart, because that was guaranteed to make her laugh in the middle of recitation. Some nights, though, she would turn off the lights and close her bedroom door and lock it. On those nights, we knew she was having a serious discussion, one that could not be disrupted. In our teenage years, the number of these silent, dark nights of prayer increased. Looking back, I suppose my mother had a lot to pray about. One summer, for example, I returned from Iran wearing jeans without back pockets. I got myself a boyfriend whom I never actually saw because he lived hours away. We just talked on the phone about how hot he thought my ass looked in pocketless jeans, the one and only time he'd seen me. Another year, I lied to my parents and told them I was going to the football game with girlfriends, but instead I went with our family friend's son, who happened to be a hot basketball player with a six-pack. The older we got and the more secrets Rehana and I concocted and kept from our mother, the more we felt threatened by her evening stretches of solitary prayer in search of clarity. Every night when she closed the door, we felt vulnerable, as if our minds and hearts were subject to a search, as if even the deepest corners of our minds were no longer ours alone. We anxiously waited her out, wondering what she had learned about us this time, what suspicions her antenna had picked up. Then, in 2009, my sister decided to make a pilgrimage to London to see Michael Jackson's This Is It concert. Rehana was 19. 19 is the age an American child backpacks through Europe or a string of developing countries to quote-unquote find herself with little interference from her parents. But by Iranian standards, 19 is no more grown up than 14. And by the Iranian standards of my family, the idea of a 19-year-old girl traveling to London, a bustling city, was unbearably frightening. When Rehana got up at 3 a.m. to sign up for the Michael Jackson ticket lottery, my mother and father neither objected nor showed interest. I imagine they assumed the idea would deflate on its own when her name wasn't drawn. But Rehana's idea very quickly transformed from ethereal to material when her name was drawn within days. She won the opportunity to purchase a ticket to the 2010 concert. I'm going to go to a Michael Jackson concert in London, Rehana announced to our parents one afternoon while we were having tea. My mother and father both looked at their tea glasses, brought them up to their lips, and took a sip before setting them back down. It's just a concert, Rehana continued in the silence that followed her announcement. Everyone our age has been to a concert. Why don't you wait until he moves his concert here? My mother asked. Because I don't know that he will. You don't understand. I can't miss this opportunity to see him. Besides, I signed up for a lottery. I won a ticket. You didn't win a ticket, my father said. You won the chance to spend money on a ticket. Yes? Yeah, but I still won. Only in America. My father shook his head and mumbled. Wait, isn't that how Hajj tickets work in Iran? I asked. I was also at the table, but was mostly remaining silent. Doesn't your name get drawn and then you can register and buy tickets? Yes, but we don't call that winning, my father replied. You've never left the country except to visit my sisters, and now you expect us to just be comfortable letting you get on a plane and go, my mother continued. Why don't you all just come with me then? Rehana suggested. You know why. Because 1, we're not citizens. The visa process is difficult. And 2, because your sister's wedding is in 2 months. At this point, the average US born and raised child might slam her fist on the table, push back her chair, stand up and yell, well, I'm 19. I don't even need your permission to buy a ticket and go. I already have the money. Hopefully you all come around. So it came as a surprise when Rehana did raise her voice and say all those words in that order. The following day, my mother leaned against the doorway of my room and looked at me while I lay on my bed texting my fiance. Just let it go, Mama. She's just going to a concert and coming back, I sighed. But she's never been anywhere like that. A big city alone, it's too much. It's a city, Mama. There are millions of people there. She's not alone. We're not like the millions. She stands out, Shokoofeh. We all stand out. It's not safe. I mean, you and Daddy left Iran and came to the United States when you were only a little older than her. Exactly. I know what it's like to leave home, to leave family. Mom, she's not immigrating. She's going to a concert. We weren't immigrating either, Shokoofeh. We were leaving for an MBA. I was supposed to be back home with my sisters 2 years later, she said, tearing up. I rolled my eyes. You're so dramatic. You don't understand. No, I said, I don't understand how a concert is related to your immigration story. I paused before adding, well, what are you going to do? What can I do? She said, I just won't give her any money for the trip. If she asks, I won't sign any of her papers if she needs signatures. Yeah, but she probably doesn't. And she already has Pete's paycheck saved up. You know her. She barely spends. Well, there's nothing we can do if she isn't going to wait for permission. I will just pray that what is best for her happens. Over the next few weeks, Rehana printed and filled out her visa forms. She purchased plane tickets and found a hotel and figured out what she should eat while she was there. She also listened to Michael Jackson nonstop, every day, every minute, in her car, in the shower, in her bedroom. She was memorizing every song before the concert. In the meantime, my mom and I had the same conversation over and over and over again. It always started with, I don't know what to do, and ended with, there's nothing I can do but pray. That's it.
It's wonderful. Boy, the whole piece is so good. You guys have to read the whole thing. That's great to hear. That was Shokoofeh. And we're now moving on to Katherine Whitney. Again, as I mentioned, Katherine is one of our 2 great editors of this book. So extra round of applause for Katherine. Katherine was drawn into the Iranian diaspora by marriage and became fully engaged on the part of her 2 Iranian American children. Writing has helped her better understand her role as a member of this diverse diaspora. And editing My Shadow is My Skin has provided a community and a feeling of belonging she never imagined possible. Katherine, so great to have you.
Thank you so much, Farnaz. And I do want to say that for me and for Layla also, it's so wonderful to have you all in a virtual room and to hear everyone speak, read their words aloud. I mean, it brings a whole life to these stories that the two of us spent a lot of time with. So thank you for that. And also, I just want to do a shout out to all of you who have worked so hard to put these 3 readings together, because it's a lot of work. And Roia and Mandana in particular, aided by Dena and Layla Rajabzadeh, and then our moderators, Sahar and Anita and Farnaz. So thank you to all of you. I'm going to read a part of my essay, the end of my essay, which is called Mothering Across the Cultural Divide. And it's largely about learning to parent my 2 Iranian American kids. And the essay snakes through many years of our family celebrating Charshanbe Suri, which is part of it's Persian New Year. It's a purification rite of jumping over fire. This spring, 2018, Nowruz creeps up on me without warning. It's been a rough year between the fallout from the Trump presidency, my double hip replacement surgery, and the death of my dear father just a few weeks before the holiday. When I confessed to Layla, now away at college, that I forgot to set out the Hafseen this year, she texts me a photo of hers. She's watercolored each element of the Hafseen: vinegar, garlic, custard, apple, jujubes, sabzi, and sumac on its own piece of thick paper, and identified each item in English as well as in a lacy Farsi script. They look like Persian miniatures. It's a portable traveling Hafseen taped up on the wall of her apartment, and I covet it. Charshanbe Suri falls exactly a month to the day after my dad died. Because of this and all the stress of the past year, I feel compelled by some force greater than myself to go jump over the fire. Of all years, this is the one I feel the need to shed my yellow sickness and collect a little red vigor from the fire's flames. Despite having moved to Berkeley from San Francisco 10 years earlier, we've only gone to the Persian Center for Charshanbe Suri as a family a few times. We went in the early years when the kids were still preteens and didn't mind being seen with their parents. But by the time Layla hit high school, she was more interested in going with friends than family. And Farhad never really liked the scene there. Too crowded, he complained. I tried to coax Kian, now 16, to get off the couch and come with me. But he's nursing a sprained ankle, the result of a skateboarding mishap. Kian's Iranian identity is more low-key than his sister's, limited to exchanging knowing nods, like secret handshakes, with the handful of Iranian American boys who go to his high school. Nah, I'll pass, he says. I'll buy you kebabs, I say, a blatant attempt at bribery. Bring me back some, he counters hopefully. Absent any company, I drive downtown alone and back myself into an impossibly small parking space. As I'd done so many years before, I make my way toward the thumping beat of music in front of the Persian Cultural Center. As always, the street is blocked off. Now there are two lanes of flaming logs to accommodate the increased crowds that come in from all over the East Bay. I get in line and text Layla. I'm at the Persian Center, I write her. I can't remember how to say the chant in Farsi. Behind me, a woman says something in Farsi to her neighbor. I hear the English word tourist, and I wonder if she's talking about me. I still don't speak the language, but I've learned enough vocabulary to get the gist of what people are talking about, and it's especially helpful when they slip an English word in here and there. I look around. I still stand out as much as I did that night 12 years ago. Everything I've internalized about Iranian culture, every word or phrase I've learned, everything I've taught my kids is invisible to the people around me as I stand here in line. I turn and smile at her, smugly pretending to have understood what she said. She smiles sheepishly in response. You have no idea, I think. In front of me, a family fans out across the two parallel runways. Two sisters hold hands and jump together on one side. In the next lane over, their older brother races to beat them to the finish. Then it's my turn. I haven't heard back from Layla, so I run and jump on my new hips, chanting in English, "My yellow sickness to you, your red glow to me." As I walk back to the car, I feel better for having jumped. But maybe it's not so much a deep connection to Iranian culture that's changed my mood. Maybe it's more than I needed some ritual, any ritual, to channel my grief. In recent years, my work as an ambassador to this culture has diminished. My children have grown more fully into their Iranian American selves and are deciding what that means on their own. I consider the possibility that I've excavated as much as I can from this culture that isn't mine and that's never completely let me in. Long ago, after our first of 3 family trips to Iran, when the kids were very young, I imagined our family as a tapestry I was weaving, one with an Iranian warp and an American weft. And I imagined that one day I would hand over the unfinished weaving with all its complicated threads to my children for them to interpret, pick apart, reweave, and embroider with details of their own. Perhaps, I tell myself, that time has come. I'm almost back to the car when I get a text back from Layla. Sorki ye to asman, zardi ye man as to. Let your readiness be mine, my paleness yours. Thank you, I write back.
Thank you, Katherine. That's Katherine Whitney, writer and editor. And for our last reader this evening, we have Iraj Isaac Rahmim, and his essays and fiction have appeared in a very long list of journals, and they've been broadcast by Pacifica Radio. A McDowell Colony, Yaddo, Vermont Studio Center, and BCCA fellow, Bread Loaf Writers Conference nonfiction award winner. His writing has been selected 6 times as Notable Essays by Best American Series, twice nominated for and received a special mention from the Pushcart, and many other awards I have to leave out. He is a member of the nonfiction faculty at the San Miguel Writers Conference and is working on a memoir about his life in Iran and a novel set in Dubai and San Diego. And if that wasn't enough, he holds a PhD in biochemical engineering from Columbia University and has been awarded over 20 patents worldwide on energy technologies. Iraj Isaac Rahmim.
Thank you so much. It's so wonderful to actually hear the other writers and participate in this and be in this book with everybody. And I feel very, very honored. So the essay that I have in this book is titled Sacrifices. And well, it's a fairly long one, so I'm just going to read an excerpt of it. I'll start from the beginning. I will jump around a bit, but hopefully in a way that it does make sense. And then, you can certainly read it in the book. So I'll just start from the beginning. Shortly after my new girlfriend, Debbie, took me to meet her parents, I sat locked in their apartment with her stepfather, Jack, holding a knife to my neck. We were in the living room, Jack and me, staring at each other and listening to my girlfriend and her mother, now locked out, fist banging on the door. They sounded scared. Jack, please don't hurt him, they shouted. Debbie and I had met only a month earlier. She had answered my ad for a roommate, open-minded M or F, moved in within a week, and we fought and then had sex the very first night. She never moved to her own bedroom. She was average looking in most respects, with straight blonde hair down to the shoulder blades and a bit of a baby face, red apple cheeks, very light blue eyes, and an easy and generous smile. She was neither too thin nor fat, neither tall nor short. Now, many years later, I, for the most part, picture her sunk comfortably into an old, overstuffed sofa, smoking and drinking a glass of red wine just poured from a screw-cap jug and looking at her raised bare feet. I have perfect feet, she would say. That was important to her. She was 29. I was 18. I had come from Iran to the United States 2 years earlier. The open-minded in my ad, at least to me, meant don't hate me because of where I'm from. She wondered out loud what I was looking for, and I set her mind at ease. This was 1980. It was the time of first prize pigs in county fairs named Ayatollah, of camel jockey go home slogans, and of no dogs or Iranians allowed signs in restaurants. We visited Debbie's mom and her husband Jack one late afternoon. Their apartment was small, the furniture worn and ugly, and there was a musty smell with a fog of smoke in the air. Jack was leaning deeply into a pea green stuffed chair, a filterless cigarette dangling on his lower lip. Empty cans of Milwaukee's Best sat on the end table beside him. He was perhaps 6'3" or 6'4", with a gray ponytail, an unkempt beard, and darkly circled sunken eyes. He had no shirt on, and his white hairless body was covered with tattoos of skulls and snakes and eyes. I don't know how the discussion turned to my background, and with my naive answer, Iran, Jack leaned forward and frowned, got up suddenly, grabbed Debbie and her mom by the wrist, and with their eyes wide, dragged them to the front door, shoved them out, and locked it. He then turned slowly and came back, bent down with a groan by the end table, felt for a moment under it, and pulled out the knife. He sat beside me and put the blade on my throat. The blade was curved and it felt cold and smooth. The banging on the door was loud as they begged Jack for my safety. Do you know what happens when a man's throat is called, he asked. His cut, he asked, and pulled toward me. I had just taken a course in human biology, and I did know the answer. With the blade pressed against my skin, I started describing the trachea, its function in moving fresh air from the mouth and nose to the lungs, and the spent air back out. I also talked about the possibility of cutting key arteries, whose incision would result in bleeding and death. With the knife at my neck, a certain tunnel vision clarity of mind had taken over. The kind you have when another car comes towards you on a narrow two-lane road with the high beams on, and you focus on a dark and relatively limited feature of the road, the side bumps or the center line perhaps, so as to not get blinded. As I spoke, Jack watched me with a progressively less pronounced smile. He looked puzzled. He took a drag from his cigarette, dropping a length of ash onto the couch beside me, got up and put the knife back under the end table, and sank back into his easy chair. The dark circles under his eyes appeared larger than before. The ash sat there perched on the edge in one piece. I looked around at the mostly bare walls. There was a shadow box on the opposite wall, holding 2 medals and a small bronze Vietnam Veterans of America banner. Perhaps I was to be an outlet for years of defeat and resentment, an explanation, or maybe a scapegoat, as he himself had been and was still, cleansing them, bearing all sins and guilt into the wilderness. But I did not cooperate. Perhaps he had felt a momentary superiority to me, and it was gone. We sat like that, silently, for a couple of minutes. The banging and pleading outside continued, but not as loudly. And then I got up and let the women in. I'm going to stop here.
Iraj Rahmim. So thank you so much. And thank you to all the readers. We are lucky now we have the chance to hear more from each of them. And we will now open the chat itself for your comments and any questions you have. You should feel free to ask the entire group a question. You can direct your questions to individual people about specific passages or about anything else. I'm going to start the conversation, and I wanted to ask all of the contributors here a couple of questions. So again, this is to all of you, and anybody who wants to respond, just unmute yourself and jump in. You don't have to all respond if you don't want to. as writers, I think we often have stories that we feel compelled to write, but even those sometimes take forever. They take years to be told for whatever reason, whether that's after we start working on them literally or not. So I'm curious about the narrative in this collection, the one that we've heard from tonight, and how did it finally get told for you? And maybe another way to put it is, what are the challenges in your life to be this self-revealing? What are the challenges that are required to overcome, necessary to write a successful personal essay?
I'll start. I'll just say that for me, it didn't feel like a challenge. I think I felt compelled. I think I always have felt compelled to tell my story in a very deeply personal way. So I can't say more than that, except that it came easily for me. Not that it, yeah, just that the drive to do it came easily.
I think, yeah, as a writer and as a human being, I think a lot of us spend a lot of time and energy not telling the truth, primarily to ourselves, hiding it or so forth. And at some point, I think writers who want to say something that matters actually just make a decision, which is, I'm going to tell the truth. And just kind of go at it. And then really it's not a challenge after that. It's a necessity. It's a part of you.
Iraj, I'm going to respond to that because I think in your piece, you're very honest about looking at yourself, looking at your relationship to poverty, to your identity, and the challenges those things have brought. Just that looking, but it's clear that you're brave enough to do it. But it's work, so I think it's much to be admired.
It's yeah. Again, it's once you decide to go at it. I remember once I was in a workshop and there was a really good writer, and she was talking. She just happened to be wealthy, and she was just talking about how he can't. Something important had happened in her car, but she can't say it because the car was a Bentley, you know, or something. And it mattered, you know. I'm like, well, you know, the fact that your car was a Bentley actually is part of the story, and it gives depth to the story. So, yeah, I'm sorry you're not driving a broken 30-year-old VW, but it's you. Just say it. Just say it out loud, you know.
Others?
I definitely wrote this essay in response to a lot of the Iranian American literature that I was reading and not seeing my own experience of like being queer and Iranian American at both of those intersections not really being written about. And when I saw the call for submissions, I thought that, because the call for submissions is like, what is something that is unsaid that needs to be said? And that was kind of like the kernel catalyst that all the essays kind of rallied around. And it was about writing what we don't talk about. And so that was the first thing that came to my mind. I was like, well, this is something that I've been directly told not to talk about. And I decided to break that. And I've been very happy to see the response to it be so positive as well, and so welcoming in and of itself. So, and I think that the more we write about the things that, you know, what Iraj was saying, that we hide, the more clarity that arises, and also more community, because we find that we have more in common with one another than what we're trying to hide from one another and pretend that we're this artifice outside of ourselves.
Thank you. Katherine.
To speak specifically to that question about how long it takes, I feel like my my essay has been evolving over all these years of parenting. And I've written it a bunch of different times, mainly over the years, right? Just in journals or just trying to sort of figure out what my role is, what my kids' role is, and then just stories about how they engage with their culture so I remember. But it really took form because we went to, Layla and I both went to this incredible writing workshop taught by Persis Karim and Amita Amirzwani on writing your Iranian identity, which Dena and Roia, actually, now that I look at you, have both taken. They offered it a number of different times. And from that workshop came the, so the impulse to do, or the assignment, if you will, to do the book, which made me tie the essay up to some degree, basically bringing it up to the present moment. But it changed a lot, right? Because my kids got older and my understanding and perspective of what my role was changed. And my understanding about my husband's relationship with his own culture and changed, and my daughter's relationship to him changed. So it was really it evolved interestingly. And it was a way to kind of make peace for me and for my daughter. It was a way to make peace with all of it, I think. So it's a good question.
Yeah, and your essay really does show that piece, the long evolution of it. Any other contributors want to chime in?
Well, I might as well, since everyone else I think has also said. Mine, builds really well off what Katherine was saying, also came out of a writing workshop. And specifically the writing workshop was titled, it's interesting to see what these writing workshops focus on that kind of nurtures the story that it does. Mine, the one I took was, I study in the English department at UC Berkeley. I'm a PhD student, but I took a class in the ethnic studies department that was a creative writing class, but it was titled Writing Across Genres. And so I think my piece really came out of was inspired a lot by reading the work of very strong women who the course reading was like designed so that you read an author whose work you read an author in a genre that you don't often associate with that author's. So for example, like Leslie Marmon Silko, instead of a novel, we read her memoir, The Turquoise Ledge, or Edwidge Danticott's memoir instead of her novels. And we also read like Toni Morrison's speeches instead of like the novels. And so I think there was something that was really liberating about watching authors kind of move between genres that kind of unlocked something for me to be able to produce that work. And honestly, just that it was in the ethnic studies department, and it was just not a white space in the same way that the English department is. And so it felt more comfortable to be able to kind of, like you're saying, just like speak the truth of what.
Thank you to all of you for those honest answers. So I have another question. I know there's a couple questions coming in on the chat, but let me follow up with my second question, which is about yourselves as compared to yourselves as writers. So living in the diaspora of any culture is unique. It's its own thing. And some of you have used the language of choice or choosing what you want from your cultural heritage. And then on the other hand, some of you talk about as an inheritance, a kind of whether you like it or not. I think in each of the essays of each of the five of you, in your own way, those essays are aware of privilege, whether they're ones you have or ones you don't have. And I think that's connected to the ability to choose what you inherit. So my question is, how has the notion of these choices or the lack of them impacted your sense of identity?
I'll take that one. I have a bit in my essay towards the end that talks about old living in the new way, which comes from a chapter title of Audre Lorde's biomythography, Zami. And she was a lesbian activist poet in the 1950s, African-American, and all of her intersections weren't declared at a time. that she wasn't seeing herself, and she wrote it down. And so when I think of old living in the new way, I think of living in a diaspora really encompasses that, especially as we are encountering our culture in contrast with another culture and kind of creating a sense of hybridity that we otherwise wouldn't have if, for example, we were living in Iran. Like, just in terms of how, you know, I live my life, I think of like a lot of how being inspired by Katherine's essay this past Nowruz, and I painted my own haftzine because I couldn't go to the market and get sabzi and get all of the ingredients needed for a haftzine. And so the fact that I was like reading something within the diaspora, replicating it, and that was something that I was looking at that process and seeing it and be like, this is what the diaspora is, this remixing and remaking. And what I love about it is that I think it really makes me a fuller person, because I'm not limiting myself to one or the other, but being able to be really fully myself in a way that otherwise I'd be denying a part of myself in a different way.
I really like this conversation is so interesting, and this question is so interesting, and I'm really interested in thinking about this idea of like choices or lack thereof of choices, and I think it does really resonate in all these different pieces. And I'm especially really thinking, Roia, about your piece and the kind of just the plethora of objects that were in that chest. And one of the things that I think about a lot with respect to choice and lack thereof is that I've actually been thinking a lot in preparation for this reading as I've been like rereading these essays, is that one of the things that I think that I was denied is as an immigrant at like the age of 3. And part of why it felt so confusing growing up was that I felt like I was grieving something, but I didn't have anything very concrete. Like I was denied the very concrete memories or like the concrete objects in order to understand what I was grieving. So whereas like someone can have a chest full of those objects where you say like, I feel this sadness or this loss because like this person in this photo is not, like I had this memory there, this person in this photo, I no longer am in touch with. Or like my mom like had very physical things, like my wedding dress is still in Iran. Like I didn't think I wouldn't bring it. Like she had these very physical things. Whereas like when you immigrate, or I think even when you're born here, but still very much kind of in between, you don't have anything concrete like that to hold on to. Like you don't have these concrete objects that are like, oh, I have these things in Iran that I like miss, or your conception of family because you're 3. And so you kind of form the family that's around you. And so you don't have that until you go back. And I think in my story, it was like you went back and you realize like, oh, I found the things that I was grieving, but I didn't understand that I was grieving all along. And so I think with respect to choice, I've thought a lot about that. Like the actual object itself, like a photo might be really upsetting for my mom to see. She doesn't like to see old photos. She kind of hides them too, you know, in like these, under these, like in these corners in these boxes. But like, she has that at least to kind of look at and be like, oh, this is the thing this is kind of that hole that I feel is this, in ways that I don't necessarily have. So.
I love that one of the things you found that you were grieving was actually American pop culture export, the Michael Jackson music. And it's a part of that, like the globalization, but it's part of your experience of Iran was Michael Jackson. So.
I think that's a really interesting question, Farnaz. Thank you for that, because I have not really thought about how much of it was choice. I mean, I think it was both, for me, both choice and responsibility. And I think when I came into my relationship with my husband before we were married, there wasn't a lot of Iranian culture, and that kind of crept in the longer we were together. And there were certain rules that I didn't understand, like engaging with his Iranian family. And he had been here for such a long time that he wasn't able to prep me beforehand. He was only able to tell me after the fact that I had made a mistake, or what is a way to, you know, help me better engage the next time, but it always felt undercutting. So that felt like it wasn't necessarily a choice. But, and then with my, you know, sort of taking on this project of teaching my kids, felt like I chose that. And it was really spurred largely by my daughter because of her incredible interest, right? But at times I didn't know all the facets as I was getting into it. That was the other part of it, that, you know, that sort of, I was gung-ho, but I wasn't necessarily going to be granted, all the doors weren't going to open for me necessarily. And that, I have to say, that's how this the way in which this writing workshop and this writing project really changed things for me, because all of a sudden there was this new idea about diaspora that was very inclusive. So that has been, it's like, oh, I can be part of this group with all of you here, and it's diverse and nuanced and interesting. And it wasn't that, that's part of the discovery that I've, you know, come to through this process. So, but it's interesting to break that down. What's choice? What's inherited and responsibility? And it's both for me, I think.
I just want to sort of add a little bit to that, which is, you know, one way of looking at this choice versus what's forced on you is the sadness that comes. But the other one, when you think about the choice, is the positive aspect, which is you can choose to become a larger human being than if you were not an immigrant or multicultural. You know, this is not a zero-sum game. The pie gets larger as you choose to become a larger human being, learn more things, do more things. And that is something it takes a while to figure out that is something to be celebrated.
I would just add that the way Shokoofeh describes her experience as having immigrated at the age of 3 and having that the live breathing experience was so early in her life. And that resonates with me, because the only experience I had in Iran was as a very, very young child for less than a year. So I feel like really all I had were these inanimate objects, and I was surrounded by them because my parents just flooded our house with these objects, you know, these sheepskin rugs and these tapestries and pillows. And then there was, of course, there was the singing and the poetry and the parties. But in many ways, the only experience I had was the diaspora. So in some ways, I think I always craved to understand what the live version, and I know that's not really a fair way to describe it, but like, what's the live version of this culture? Because I feel like I'm associating with this other version of it, and it's this other, it's this other version of it that I know, and I wanted to know the real thing. And then Katherine's experience resonates for me because in many ways I tried to make it live by making it live for my children. You know, we didn't celebrate Nowruz in my home when I was growing up, but I chose to bring that into my family's life when I was raising children in a way to make it a live experience for them. I was really trying to make it live for myself. So there was a lot of choice involved, and it was very much of a process of trying to kind of come to terms and trying to figure out what pieces of it I wanted to have for myself, and also coming to terms with the fact that I haven't gone back to Iran, and I may never be able to go back, and that this version of it is real for me, and that I, as an Iranian woman, I am as Iranian as I need to be, that there isn't some other version of myself that's more real or authentic, but that I am myself, and that's good enough.
Oh, I've unmuted myself. Thank you. There's a question that came in the chat. I'd like to pose this to you. It's for everyone. And there's also some great comments, but let's start with this question. Thank you to all the writers. A common theme in here seems to be each writer's feeling of being an outsider in some way, as queer, immigrant, spouse, etc. How important is this sense of being other to each of your writing?
I guess I'll go first. No, that's a really, really good question. And I have come to like being the other. You know, it's through an accident of birth. I started being a Jewish kid in Iran and a left-handed kid, you know. And one of the things you learn when you're an other from the very beginning is you're getting two feeds, because there's the dominant feed and then there's the, oh, but this doesn't work for me. You know, somebody hands you as a left-handed kid a pair of scissors to cut something and you're like, wow, this is backwards, you know. So on some level, you're actually getting two stories into your life. And that is very instructive. And I think, you know, on some level, I really like it, because it's not, when you are an other, when you have this dominant narrative and then your own personal narrative that's different, you're always seeing everything from multiple angles of observation. And that gives you a depth of vision that, you know, I'm being facetious, but the unfortunates who don't have that don't get to have, you know. So it's a good thing.
Dena, it looked like you were going to jump in.
Yeah, no, definitely. Thank you for noticing that. One thing that I definitely started my writing journey, and like I need to write about being Iranian American and queer, and having that sense of like, this is what I'm making my like mission about. But I also like fear that I'm like pigeonholing myself in some ways as well, and that's like all that my writing can be seen as. And so I've been really trying to like think about like, how can we like define ourselves outside of that like other status in terms of our writing, especially in like a publishing industry that loves to exploit that. And in the sense of having a little bit more agency in my writing, not being seen as that role of the victim of like these particular power structures. And so one thing that has been really helpful for me is like imagining like infinite like futures where these types of things aren't seen as other, and really trying to, with that, envisioning almost like creating that future in and of itself, but then having a sense of like grounding it and also being understanding that this is like really important work, because it is still so nascent and new in its type of formative writing, because there's still no like queer Iranian American like literature aesthetic as far as like I can find. If you find it, please let me know. I'm going to be very interested. And also having the sense of like, what is Iranian American literature, because we have like the memoir as well as like, is a huge piece, but also like poetry is also another huge piece to that as well. So I love the fact that this is like creative nonfiction essays, because it's such a unique step in the lineage of Iranian American literature. And I think that that's why the anthology is also really important as well. So I think that like walking the other path in terms of writing can be a little fraught. There's a lot of gifts there that you can find, and that really are something that tends to be like so fruitful. Like just sitting in this panel and reading is something that I wouldn't have imagined 5 years ago. And creating that is in and of itself really important. But also I don't wish to only be seen as that, because it's only one aspect of my full facet of being a human. And trying to kind of, going back to what I was saying previously, is like understand that we have more in common despite our differences than our governments or systems would like us to believe.
I was just going to say thank you, Dena, for that. And thank you also, Iraj. I agree with you that it's an opportunity. Feeling other is an opportunity. And for me, it was what spurred the writing, really, because the writing is what helped me understand, really sort of exploring and really delving down deeply. So it's a much more, my answer is much more personal. that it gave me an opportunity to explore something and research something and really learn about something broadly, you know, the Iranian culture, and then really specifically, like, what does it mean to my family, and what, you know, how does my family fit into this bigger picture? And so it was an opportunity. It's definitely an opportunity. I agree with you.
Sorry, I keep muting and unmuting myself. Anybody else want to jump in on that one? There's another question that's come. There's a range of experiences of time spent in Iran across the panel and relationship to the country and culture. I'm curious about the struggles any of the writers have had in feelings of authenticity, so-called imposter syndrome, etc.
I'll jump in on that one. Oh my God, that's yeah. I mean, that's what I was trying to get to in my answer to my last question. In the answer to the last question, you know, I think it has partly to do with also being a USer, about the whole mirage of like the mixing pot, you know, of like how we sort of lose our sense of identity here in the US. And how we're supposed to sort of become this sort of white, you know, this sense of whiteness. I think I've really struggled as someone who spent a good part of the younger part of my life trying to hide. I think I've spent the latter part of my life, or the second half of my life, trying to find ways to show myself. And in doing so, feeling terrified of what it is that I'm trying to say and who I'm saying it to. And that's why I think being a part of this book has been really an amazing experience, because, and others of you have talked about this, but there's this sense of belonging amongst this community of writers where we have all chosen through the vehicle of personal essay to tell a story about ourselves and to show a part of ourselves that, you know, when you're walking down the street or even having a conversation with a friend, you don't always get to share these kinds of stories with people. And so it was a risk. You know, we all took that risk with one another and with our communities and kind of going public with these stories. And I feel a real strong connection with all of you. And it gives me less of a sense of that imposter syndrome, because I feel like it, I don't know, gives me permission. It gives all of us permission to be able to tell our stories. Oh, yeah.
When haven't I felt like an imposter as an Iranian would be a better question, especially because my father would always intensely tell me, he's like, you're not Iranian, you're American. And I'd be like, okay, great. And why did I grow up speaking Farsi as my first language? And then having this sense of like, even amongst other like Iranians of my generation being like, oh, I didn't know this like one cultural touchstone in like Iran, or this one particular instance in like Los Angeles even, because that it has its own like layer of like diasporic community that feels like very insular and has created its own culture. But one thing that's been really helpful is kind of learning that like, I think we all have felt that way at one point or another, whether we are Iranians in Iran growing up as Iranians, or coming to America as Iranian immigrants, or growing up in America as Iranian Americans. There's always that sense of like, there's something about me that isn't inherently Iranian. And I think that maybe comes from the fact that it's hard to define what is Iranian. There's so many different ethnicities and religions and like different ethnic groups that have all been flattened into like a national identity that either doesn't have nuance to it or based in reality. And so I think that also comes to a part of it, because like just on like a very like national level, like we don't know what this definition of Iranian is that we're all trying to achieve. But I think one part of it has been really healing on a level is this anthology to be like, oh, we all have had these, like literally reading everyone's experiences, being like, oh, okay, cool, I'm not the only one. And that in itself has been like a huge, huge gift as well.
I'm curious about Katherine, your response to this. I know, Katherine, in the piece itself, you use the language of authentic or inauthentic Iranian, and it's so provocative. And you had to do this navigating for both yourself and your children. I mean, you really put yourself in that position. You talk about it as a responsibility, but I'd be curious about your feelings and thoughts about that.
I felt it was a responsibility of my motherhood, but I was also really engaged. I mean, I grew up hearing stories. I was a storyteller. I love to read. So story and narrative are really important to me always, I think. And Layla, my daughter, came into the world like that too. She loved stories. She loved books. And so I think that was part of it. You know, even our early, because really it didn't really show up until she started going to school and we started thinking about, you know, sort of an evolution, like what is interesting about our family? What can we share about our family that's different? Oh, well, this is different. And then she got so captivated by that. And we had, you know, her grandmother sending her lovely little beautiful knit dresses from Iran. And so we had we had a little bit like Roya, you know, we had these packages coming full of smelled like saffron. Well, there was usually saffron in it. You know, they had smells, and it was just this texture. And it, so I was super curious about it, and I kind of loved it. And I also felt like she was the catalyst for me, you know. And I'm grateful to her. So it was that kind of like a maternal responsibility. Like I owe it to, you're curious, I owe it to you to figure this out. And she, you know, she was asking. So, yeah.
Other panelists want to? I'm gonna read a couple of the comments here. We welcome any more questions that people have. I have more, but Dena, you've gotten a couple of comments, and I hope you can read them. But Dena, your courage is an inspiration to the youth who also struggle to be true to themselves, to summon up their own courage to declare their true selves to their family and the world. This is from a high school teacher. Thank you. I try to support this niche of students at my school, and now I have an essay to share with them, inspire them. Thank you for your courage, your faith, your love of yourself. And the very next one, Dena, your story resonates with me a lot. My relationship with my father is still recovering from my coming out and my marriage. I can't imagine going to Iran again without my husband. Thank you for putting a voice to a lot of our shared feelings and experiences. To everyone, thank you all for your transparency, especially in this time in the world when embracing all humanity is so important. Sharing your personal stories is a gift and important. New questions come in. I'm curious about what surprises came with the writing. What unexpected discoveries came that were a complete surprise? So anybody want to address that? Shokoofeh, you're smiling. You don't have to. Okay, there we go.
I love the question. I think it's so fun to think about. I don't necessarily have, like, I really want to think about this more for a while, like, because I think it's fun to think about, because I think there's also something about reading something after it gets published in a book and thinking, oh, like that line in there, like, you know, reading it as something that's written separate from you also, you know, there's that element of surprise. I think I will say that just in like listening to this conversation and all of the really like thoughtful and really interesting comments that the rest of you are making, I'm kind of surprised that like in my essay, I'm noticing now that it isn't just a question of authenticity in like, are you American enough or are you Iranian enough? But there's also this question of like, are you American enough in regards to what Iranians think an American is? And so like going back and being like, so what Michael Jackson do you listen to? And being like, what? Like, no, I don't listen to like, I don't listen to Michael Jackson. Or like something that I would get asked a lot when people knew I was studying English literature was, oh, so you've read, and then they'd say their favorite novel. And if you hadn't read it, they'd be like, what kind of like English major are you? Or like, you know, if you don't know this novel, it's the greatest novel in English literature. And so, so I think I just, in hearing all of you kind of share your experiences and your like your thoughts on just the question of authenticity. And then seeing this question, the complete surprise. I'm surprised by the fact that the question of authenticity isn't just about being American or being Iranian or being Iranian American, but about, like, it seems like if you're going to start playing that game, you're playing it with every single person's perception of what these labels are going to mean. And so you're constantly kind of creating a new version of whether, oh, you're authentic enough, or whether you're just authentic enough, or authentic, but maybe you don't know the novel. And so, or, you know, so there's all those different ways that comes across. But I love the question, and I'll keep thinking about it.
Well, that was a lovely answer.
I guess I can add something to that. You know, I think the biggest surprise every time I'm working on a piece or I finish it is how it ends up being about something completely different than when I started or what I thought it was, to a point where I have come to the conclusion that if it doesn't end up that way, if it doesn't end up being completely different from where I started it, I haven't done my job right. You know, it's because if you don't surprise yourself, if you don't learn new stuff, if you don't look back at it and say, wow, where the hell did that come from? Then, you know, you're really not doing a particularly good job. You're not applying yourself, you know. So that's kind of the biggest surprise. And then sometimes the things that you remember, specifically things that were so deep from possibly decades ago, those come up and surprise you. But really the biggest surprise is what the piece ends up being about, what the piece ends up being.
Do you remember in your piece what that was? What you thought it was going, which direction you thought it was going, and what happened? Is there something?
I think in that piece, it's sort of embarrassing to say, but why not? I just wanted to write a beautiful piece with long sentences that involved a knife. You know, it was sort of like, you know, I wanted to be this. I had read this magnificent essay called The Knife. And I was just like, you know, when I grow up, I want to be like that. And so I started it, and I had a little knife incident in my life. And then as it goes on and you dig deeper, it becomes entirely something different, you know? And it happens very often. Yeah.
For me, it's also about memory. I wrote this piece about 10 years ago during a period in my life where I was just writing feverishly all the time. And all of the pieces that I was writing were all memoir, and they were all rooted in these little flashes of memory from very early parts of my life. And I found that if I drank a cup of espresso at around 10 p.m. after I put my kids to bed and then wrote until around 2 a.m., there was this bewitching hour, this magical hour where I would just get so into my writing and memories would just flood. And I can't tell you, my older sister or my parents could probably tell you which of my memories are true and which are not. But for me, they're all real. They're very real. And you know, in order to turn them into stories, I had to elaborate. I had to give them color and taste and context, when really they're all rooted in like a flash of a memory from when I was 3 or from when I was 10, from when I was 5. So, you know, they don't come to me in a full scene. But what surprises me is how, as I sit down to write, how it begins, it takes form. And it takes form into a real picture that I believe is real, but I really may never know how much of it is real and how much not.
Someone else?
Could I just add something to that when Roya was talking? You know, they asked Leonard Bernstein, where do your compositions come from? And he said, I lie down on a couch and I close my eyes and I gradually begin to fall asleep. And when Roya was talking about that, the night, the witching, and he says, as I am going down, the piece comes to me. And the trick is not falling asleep, getting up and writing it, you know? And that's where the espresso comes in, I suppose, right?
Right. Katherine, it looked like you were jumping in.
I was going to say, to Roya, they're real because they're yours, right? So they're definitely real. And to Iraj, thank you so much for that, sort of responsibility to have an essay that surprises you, because that sort of in a beautiful way sums up what I've been trying to say. I'm not sure how successful, but that writing is the process of uncovering and discovering and understanding. And for me, the surprises are often more emotional, like the way I end up feeling and identifying that I feel, the way I couldn't really ever get in, like there was this way, I realized, that I was sort of trying to get in through my, by being the parent of my kids and like trying to understand, but also feeling at the end of the day, like I wasn't ever going to get there wherever there was, like there was still something missing in me. And it had a lot to do with, in that last scene in my essay, it has a lot to do with, on that side, no one would know, right? And that happened, that was my kid's situation too, Layla, especially when she was younger. Like she didn't have these characteristics of being Iranian. And one thing that was so interesting in putting this collection together is the diversity of voices about belonging and not belonging, and having, in some cases, people, Shokoofeh writes about this, that, you're sort of marked and discriminated against because of how you look and for being, Iranian or of Iranian descent. And for my daughter, it was like, I don't look Iranian enough. Like I want to look more Iranian so that people will accept me as, I want into this club, and so it's just an interesting, that piece is really interesting to me. Thank you for both of you.
There's several other comments that everyone should read. I have one more question for Shokoofeh, if you don't mind. I read to the, reread to the end of your piece, and I don't think I'm going to give anything away by asking this question. You seem to suggest that besides understanding that your mother has superpowers because she can pray and make things happen, you also understand her experience and her perspective when you say the same words back to each other. That you imply that you get where she's coming from in a way that I don't think early on you expected to have that insight. And so I wonder how that's helped you as an Iranian American woman and actually as a mother. What do you think enabled you, and how has it helped you, and what do you think enabled you to get to that place of seeing your mother for all of who she is?
Yeah, I understand the way I would frame it now that I am a mother is different than I would when, when I first wrote like the first draft of this piece. Now I would say that, and people who have grown kids can probably speak to this much more completely than I can, but now I feel like when you watch your child grow, you kind of are, it's like you project a lot of your own childhood experiences onto them. And so like the things that I'm afraid of for her, even when I catch myself now, like when I'm afraid of like she's going to go to high school and I think XYZ is going to happen, those are very specific things, or the things that happen to me. So there's like this whole area of things that I'm not worried about because I was kind of like, I didn't feel bothered by those, but the ones that really bothered me are the things that I'm worried about. And so it's like I'm kind of like moving through childhood again with her. And so, but I mean, when I was reading this piece, I think there was at some point where I started to, as I got older, and I started to realize that my parents' reactions to things was it wasn't that I just thought they were overreactions because I was like a teenager, that they were overreactions. And so, and I feel like maybe it was at some point like where that felt validated to like for me, that no, the reason why you felt they were overreactions was because they were overreactions. And then kind of trying to think about the fear behind, because I started to realize that it was fear that drove a lot of the kind of reservations they had. And once I kind of understood it in terms of fear, like this whole kind of, I had this whole other kind of this it's like this world of empathy kind of unlocked for me, because fear is it's scary, and fear is really uncomfortable and something everyone can relate to. And like to just imagine that everything that happened, like for my mom, like imagining, you know, I moved to New York now, I live in New York, but I feel like even, my family's in California. I feel like every time we move kind of far away, it's like she's reliving this fear of, like, you're gonna go, and I didn't go back, you know, and like it was, and then look, like it's so hard to go back now. Every time we want to go back, it's this whole thing of logistics and politics and paperwork and visa, and is it safe to go back? And so every time you go back, she kind of projects that she relives that experience. And so different versions, like between my mom and my dad, I feel like I now understand those moments where I felt like, you guys are really dramatic and overreacting. And so when this happened, and probably I didn't recognize it as this, but I think and maybe that's also a surprise, is that when I was then crafting the piece, it felt like that's something that got resolved in the process of writing, which writing does so often, kind of resolves those like questions and conflict moments, or just questions really, like that you have about those memories. Writing through them can kind of help you understand them. And so I think that moment of understanding is really about that. It's about recognizing, it's about seeing her fear for the first time as an adult who now has an understanding of what fear looks like outside of a kind of, will he love me, you know, feeling.
Oh, thank you. That acknowledgement of the power of writing is it's a great way to end the evening. We're just about out of time, even though it's just so wonderful to be together, and to hear from everybody, and to reread some of these to hear them in your voices. Thank you to everybody who attended tonight and who attended the last few weeks. We're so grateful for your attention, your reading, your curiosity, your commitment to language and to stories. I think we're going to get the link one more time up on the chat for purchasing the book, and that will be there for bookshop.org, which is a nationwide group of independent bookstores. You can also find an electronic version. I think there's a Kindle version. Am I correct? Yeah, nodding. And also the event that is happening June 20th, will also get that pasted back in as well. And please, all the contributors, don't forget to read. I didn't get to read all the lovely comments from people. Thank you to everybody. Let's have one last round of applause for all the writers. And thanks to everybody who's here. Thanks for coming. Great to have you.
Thank you all.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone.
Oh, wow. Very perfect.
What's that?